Good evening, good morning, whatever, YouTube. This is the third instalment on our FZR 600 build. Thank you for joining us. Today we're attacking wiring. Okay, so we've got to the stage that often fills a lot of people with dread, and that is the wiring harness. There's actually a lot of myths surrounding these. They're nothing like as scary as legend says, and a lot of the problems people have don't come from the fact that wiring's difficult. It comes from undoing previous bodges that other people have done. Things have been hacked off, cut, bodged and bypassed, when invariably the answer to those problems was always quite simple. So we're starting out here with a bike that was a good, reliable runner, which really helped matters along because we know everything worked. So we didn't have to worry about missing parts, things that don't run, things that don't work. Everything was working correctly. So essentially, when it came to the wiring loom, it came off in one piece. Everything's all still nice and flexible. We've got original, comparatively uncorroded connectors everywhere. And so it's really just a matter of checking it over, cleaning it and fitting it to the bike. One of the things you can do, which will make life a little bit simpler, and sometimes it can be confusing as to where this all goes, leave some of the major components attached if you can. Things like this regulator rectifier only fit in one position on the bike. If you've got this harness like this, that's a great starting point because you know where this has got to go. It can only go in one place. This therefore can only be for the tail light, and you know then you can just work through the bike in a logical manner. Everything then can go exactly where it's got to go. So we'll be concentrating on things like cleaning up these earth contacts, which are really important. We'll use some thermal paste on the back of the regulator rectifier, and just generally going through and checking. We'll be looking for chafed wires, anything that looks unusual. Place like here, that's not actually a heat spot, that's just where there's been some rust, so we've still got original factory labels on the loom, and it should be a pretty straightforward process. We're going to look for any obviously loose or damaged wires. There's really no need on this loom to buzz it out with a multimeter because we know it works, so it's just going to be a clean check, clean over all the terminals and install. As we just mentioned, one of the benefits in using a good running riding bike is we don't really have to fault trace the loom. Things that can cause problems are things like this stator connector. Now this one, as you can see, despite being very dirty, is in basically very good condition. So it's one of those things that really isn't going to need an awful lot of attention. All we're going to be doing with this, it's quite a simple process. It just receives a good solid squirt of cleaner. That's adequate, dripping wet. It's all a contact cleaner, so it's completely evaporative. And then just going in, using a cotton bud into the connector, getting through all of those, and you can see there's dirt coming off everywhere, making sure everything's clean and going through the loom in such fashion. So once we're left with that, we'll be left with a nice clean connector. It's always advisable to do the outsides as well. Doesn't create any performance benefit, but at least you know each connector's done, and it means when you go through you don't have to chase it through again. That will leave us with a good clean loom, and we'll be ready to go and fit it onto the bike. With these stator connectors, it's important to check for any signs of heat discoloration, and the reason for that is as a lot of power goes through those. These are running at around 50 volts. This is prior to it reaching the regulator rectifier, so this is a purely AC current that flows through here, and it has not as yet been regulated down to 12 volts or rectified to DC, hence of course the term regulator rectifier. So if anything's got a bad connection, these can get very, very hot. So this one's again in very good condition, but this is one of the main causes of motorcycle failure and breakdown. So make sure this connector above any other is very good and clean and free from dirt. If you have any connectors where you've got any particular corrosion, get a small screwdriver or a pick, get in there and just scrape it. You're looking for a good, clean connector. Some of the smaller connectors you can't get your cotton buds down, so doing this just gives you a second idea to make sure that you've got a totally clean connector. This one's looking good. This will be cleaned up and ready in a moment. We'll move on to all of the other connectors on the loom, and that'll give us a loom ready to fit onto the bike. Be sure to be careful when you're doing this that the contact cleaner or carb spray, whatever you're using, any solvent cleaner is fine. It's preferable to use an electrical contact cleaner. This is actually an air intake and carburetor cleaner. It's a highly evaporative solvent and it's going to work. If in doubt, just give it a little wipe over with something else as well, just to make sure there's no contamination whatsoever. But this will give us a good clean connection and enable us to make sure that the whole loom works as it was designed to do. Right, we've cleaned through our wiring loom, checked it all over, and it's ready to go on the bike. Now, of course, the first thing you've got to worry about, once you've decided which end is which, is of course how it goes on. Now, when you dismantle the bike, the best thing you can do in this scenario is take lots and lots of photographs. So going through now, we're going to look for our photographs of the bike, and look at our disassembly photographs, and we'll be able to see here, through the magic of using an iPad, that as we go through, we can see certain photographs will tell us where parts of the bike are. So we can see these come through, everything sits, and as you go through these photographs you can see here all the motorable parts and how certain things are routed. Now as we go through here, we'll be able to see, as we run through these photographs, for example here we can see that the wiring loom drops down the left hand side in front of the support where the tank is held on, so we know where that is on the frame. We can identify that. We can also identify, of course, that's where the starter motor cable runs through. And we can also see from this photograph here, when we zoom into it, that it is also where the loom runs down the side of the bike. So as we zoom in here, you can see here, there's our regulator rectifier, and there's the wiring loom runs through, and it runs behind the frame rail and then drops down. This is going to be really useful in the assembly process and will give us a good starting point on how to find the right components in the right places. Okay, we have our cleaned and checked loom ready. Now the one thing we know, the regulator rectifier mounts here. So we find this on our loom, and there it is. So we know this is the front end. These were the connectors we saw earlier on the photograph, so we know that's going to run down there, and we know it goes through here. So we know this front part of the loom needs to run through this gap here. This is where the loom disappears through into the engine section of the bike. So it's just a case of feeding it all through, and then we know this comes up here and goes through onto the tail. Now this all eventually ends up mainly on this part of the bike. So we feed this through. It's just being laid in place at the moment. So what we're going to do, there are tail-like components. We know they're going to end up here. That's all adequate for now. We're going to check back to our photographs, and that will make sure we get everything in the right places. So we're going to start at the back of the bike and just work our way forward, putting each place in, each component in where it should go. So we know, for example, that our regulator rectifier sits on this bracket here, but of course we need to check which side the cables run off these rails, because we don't want to get them in the wrong place, put the seat on, and it's going to cut through the cables. Referring back to our photographs of the bike taken at disassembly, we can see here quite clearly that the fuse box here, which is this component here, runs down just behind this tab here. So we still need to move the wiring loom down a little bit, just enough. They're not quite in position yet. I'm just feeding it through. And the whole fitting of a wiring loom is just a case of getting it into this right position. So this is going to sit about here, that would be correct. This sits through here, and this will lead to our first component being installed. So we know this goes through here. There's a little groove that sits here to locate this fuse box, and that is where that lives. So it's now just a case of going through, matching up against our photos, which tell us everything we need to know about the position of the wiring loom, and you can see lots of these little plugs and where they sit. We can make sure this is all going to sit in the correct place again. This is very important to get these items in the correct place, and this will enable us to get the whole loom in. So it's just a case of continuing like this. This is going to take up the rest of this job. There's not a lot to see here, it's just a case of lots of tedious referring to photos and plumbing into place. Once we've got the wiring loom in, the next job we're going to be tackling in the next video is going to be putting the front end in and putting the front calipers on. So we're nearly there with this one. We'll be adding a few photos at the end to show how things work with the wiring loom in, and then we'll be ready to resume the next job, which is the front end. Please do give this video a subscribe. please comment. If you're building one of these bikes yourself or restoring any 80s or 90s sports bikes, there's some great internet groups out there which can help you as well. All of these videos and all the input is greatly appreciated. One of the areas where these FZR 600s can be a little bit tricky with the wiring loom is in the section that goes through the frame in to connect to the sub-looms at the front. And that's because there's a few parts here that have to pass through this hole in the frame, like so. And these go through a grey rubber grommet. The problem is this grommet can only pass through once the wires are through it, because it's too small for the wires to go through once it's in place. So you have to pass the loom through and then work the connectors through it. It can be a little bit tricky, and then the grommet can go back into the frame. It's just one of those things that it's just there's not enough stretch for everything to go through in one place. So right now we're just going to work them through one connector at a time. Just move that one out of the way. This one can go through here, and now this one can go through. And it's just because there's a very narrow aperture in it. You just can't get each one through it at each time without a little bit of pushing and squeezing. So it's just a matter of getting these through. They're coming through now. A little bit of toing and throwing and pulling. Once each one clears, the next one's got a bit more room to move into. So okay, we're through. It sits through this way. We can now pass this through and locate it into the frame. It's going to come through this hole here. It just takes a little bit of wriggling to get it through. So it's coming through. It often pays with these parts to soak them in warm water for a little while. It makes them more pliable, because unless you're buying new ones, they're going to be 26, 27 years old and might not want to do what you want them to do. So it's just a matter of giving it a pull, and there we go, it's coming through. Just work it through with your fingertips, and eventually it's going to pop into place. There we go. So that's just coming through now, and that's the final part of affixing the main loom to the body of the bike. So we can now start to put things like the spark unit in the CDI unit, that can go on, connect up tail lights. We'll just need to refer to the manual to check which lead goes to which indicator. Now we know all of these stay inside the engine bay, because these are the ones that we had through on the previous photos. So these are all going to stay in the engine bay. This ignition switch here connects over this rail. Again, we know that because we've seen it in the photos. They're the two switches there. So it's just a matter of finding where everything goes. That matches up to this connector there, so that one will plug in there. That's the ignition switch. That's another one from the ignition switch. That also connects in here. And that just sits, as we saw in the photograph, just sits over the frame rail. These will connect to the things like the clocks and so forth that come through to the front. This is going to connect to the headlight loom, the clocks, then other things come through in various other locations.